The situation is finally changing in Ukraine, and it's first noticeable on the front lines, since in March 2026, for the first time since 2023, Russia went a whole month without making any progress on the ground while suffering record casualties. And all of this is the result of what's happening in the air, with Ukraine's dominance in the field of drones becoming increasingly clear, something that Russian bloggers are openly complaining about. And this development is also visible in the long-range war being waged by both sides, with Ukraine now managing to hit far more targets in Russia than the other way around, and that's something new as well. Let's review these points one by one, beginning with the situation at the front. And as I said last year, the Russians bet everything on fiber optics by industrializing as much as possible, which caused heavy losses among the Ukrainian ranks. But they also stopped working on resilience to electronic warfare or on the range of their conventional drones. As a result, the Ukrainians, who are now also firing 40,000 fiber optic FPV Kamikaze drones per month, and that's a Russian figure, have simply caught up in this area in terms of scale. But they continued to work on other technologies and made tremendous progress with traditional drones. For example, now they all know how to strike more than 5 kilometers behind the line of contact, even the smallest drones. And the proportion of drones equipped with artificial intelligence has increased significantly with the local production of small computers. And the Ukrainians have also developed relay communication systems that work despite communication jamming. And their drones controlled via Starlink can also operate in areas even when GPS is denied. AI systems have also advanced a lot. Unlike the first generation, which merely aimed at a distant designated blob of pixels, now as the drone descends, it recognizes the shape, knows it's a tank, and sees whether the tank is protected. And if the tank is protected, for example with cages, it will instead aim for the cannon to make the cannon unusable, so the tank becomes useless. This is the third generation of artificial intelligence. And in this field as well, we see that the Ukrainians have really taken a huge lead, not just over the Russians, but everywhere in the world. For the Russians, their focus has been on producing as many fiber optic drones as possible, causing them to fall behind in other areas, including AI. And the Chinese have also just put a noose around the neck of all fiber optic buyers from both sides by tripling the cost of the raw material, on which the Russians depend 100% and the Ukrainians nearly 75%. And the result is that Russia is now spending crazy amounts of money on drones that are less effective than those developed by the Ukrainians. Incidentally, with fiber optic drones, part of the drone's payload capacity is wasted. By carrying this fiber optic cable, which adds weight, there are fewer explosives, so these drones are less effective and, incidentally, less mobile. You risk losing the cable and can't go everywhere. Moving it on the ground often leads to the cable being cut, since the technology is still fairly fragile. And the proportion of drones that manage to hit their target using artificial intelligence is now higher than what is achieved with fiber optics, according to statistics and the feedback I've received from the Ukrainians themselves. Next, if we move on to drones, not the camera drones, but the small bombing drones. So you have the DJI drones, all those traditional drones we usually see, which have been adapted to carry grenades, and then you have the next size up, which are called Yaga, and that's really a Ukrainian specialty. These multi-rotor drones can carry up to 70 kilograms depending on the model, and it's estimated that the Ukrainians produce about 20,000 of them per month, with, for example, 100,000 units in a year for the Vampire model alone. And incidentally, at that scale, these very large drones now cost only $8,000, despite the onboard artificial intelligence, resilience to Russian jamming, and infrared cameras. So these drones, they carry out a lot of missions. For example, they perform logistics missions. I made a video specifically on this topic, which is currently being finalized in editing. But in it, you can see that at night, from the position where I was, they made 20 deliveries of 40 kilograms of food and ammunition to the guys who were on the front line. And obviously, you can only do that with Yaga drones. It's much more efficient than with ground logistics or ground robots. One mission at night, instead of about 20, with an aerial drone. And by the way, ground robots are much more easily destroyed and detected than an aerial drone that can go and come back in just a few minutes. So the enemy doesn't have time to launch a kamikaze drone to intercept it. Then there's the whole mine-laying side, which is obviously doable, and there's the bombing part. And when you have drones that are capable of dropping shells, which are like artillery shells, of the same size, with meter-level precision, it's really incredibly effective. And this heavy bombing capability for the Yaga, today, for example, it is credited with the victory in the Battle of Kupiansk, in which they managed to liberate the city. By having a kind of very precise rolling barrage, which was in front of the Ukrainians who were trying to launch an assault and go on the offensive in this city, simply because a lot of artillery was landing exactly in the right place, including in urban areas. Whereas when you have incoming fire, regular artillery fire, it can be blocked by buildings. But in this case, it falls straight down vertically onto the targets. And they said that this was really effective, while the Russians on their side simply thought that their artillery gave them such dominance that they didn't need to use large drones for bombing, so they developed this aspect much less. And so whether it's in logistics or bombing, the Russians have fallen behind on Baba Yaga drones, and it's estimated today that they only produce 2,000 to 3,000 per month, which isn't bad, but it's still 1/10 as many as the Ukrainians. Next, we have the whole category of drones called ISR, which are fixed-wing observation drones that can fly for 8 hours, 12 hours, or even 24 hours for some. The goal is to have constant visibility along the front and on what's happening on the other side of the contact line. For the Ukrainians, the goal is to spot the Russians preparing assaults before they reach the front line. For the Russians, it's more about gathering intelligence deep behind the lines. And here as well, the efforts the Ukrainians have made in electronic warfare, in jamming, and in resilience give them the ability to go further. For example, I told you about the Gord drone, Airlogics, which was able to go more than 80 kilometers deep into Russian territory, and which already last year was able to prepare the major offensive on Kursk with a great deal of effectiveness. The Russians couldn't see it, weren't able to jam it or intercept it, and as a result, since the Russians once again mainly worked on fiber optics, yes, they have Baba Yaga drones with fiber optics that work up to 30 kilometers away and complete missions, but ultimately it doesn't give them mass. It's as simple as being able to simply launch long-range drones, which can also drop small kamikaze drones. But what you need to remember is that the vast majority of these drones are used for observation. That means if you want to correct an artillery strike, if you want to send FPV kamikaze drones, those drones need to be present. And very early in the conflict, starting in the summer of 2024, the Ukrainians began hunting these observation drones, not with shoulder-fired missiles, anyone can do that, but especially since shoulder-fired missiles are rare, expensive, and the technology is complicated to develop. And the Ukrainians started sending FPV kamikaze drones. I made a dedicated video on this subject for you. I was the first to really notice it because I was in contact with combat units that had developed this technique at that time. And so, little by little, they improved their technique. They launched these interceptor drones by sending them up with Baba Yaga drones at high altitude to have an even greater operational range. And this Ukrainian method, which has developed widely, has led to situations where the sky is no longer as well monitored by Russia as it was in the past. Once again, because both sides are producing about the same number of drones, maybe with a slight advantage for the Ukrainians now, but in any case, these are very large quantities. But on the other hand, when it comes to the ability to intercept and destroy enemy ISR drones, the Ukrainians have really gained the upper hand. So much so that at the beginning of 2026, we are starting to see offensive missions being carried out by Ukrainian armored vehicles against Russian positions, without the Russians being able to see them coming. And they have time to launch, for example, their FPV drones to protect themselves, and that's something we probably haven't seen for a year and a half. So that means that overall there is battlefield transparency that favors the Ukrainians. Since they are on the defensive 90% of the time, they're not the ones launching assaults. This means the Russians must expose themselves and can't gather troops. If around 40 men were in a trench, we'd spot them, and logistics make them easier to detect. And so, the Russians aren't able to launch an assault with enough force to overwhelm an area or a Ukrainian unit. Especially now, the Ukrainians are producing more than 9,000 FPV kamikaze drones per day. And my friends who are on the front line told me that they've already stocked about 150 ready-to-go kamikaze drones in each launch area, whereas before they only had about 50. And so each drone launched from Line 1, since it can strike 5 kilometers behind Line 0, that allows them to individually target each Russian since they usually count on 2 FPV kamikaze drones per target. But overall, it means they have the numbers and the time to destroy, to kill, pretty much every Russian who charges at their line before they reach Line 0, the contact line. And that obviously is a big advantage. But then the limitation is the number of pilots, meaning you need more than 2 pilots to be able to launch these kamikaze drones because they can only operate one at a time. And here the Ukrainians have managed to do 2 things that are pretty amazing. The first is that you can have your drones piloted by people who are not in your area. If there are people who are 50 kilometers away, who have nothing in front of them, who are not under attack at that moment, through Starlink, they will be able to take control of the kamikaze drones that are in a trench and launch them. So you need a few more antennas than before, you need more antennas than pilots. But by connecting them to the internet, you can have 3, 4, or 5 kamikaze drones launched at the same time. And so, logically, you have the ability to kill or attack many more Russians who are attacking, whether they're in vehicles or on foot. And the second really positive thing is that I have confirmation from a second group, a second company, that has managed to create what we call drone swarms, kamikaze drones. The pilot, even if he's alone, instead of taking one drone and sending it to its destination and target, he'll take the first drone, and there will be 5 drones following it. They only pilot the first drone. When they arrive in the area where they know the enemy is coming, they will assign a task with artificial intelligence to each of these drones that are flying. First drone, you're going to hit. Second drone, this guy. Third drone, this quad. Fourth drone, this dirt bike. And like that, it allows not just 1 takeoff every 3 minutes, but 6 takeoffs every 4 minutes. And this way, they really have the ability to strike from very far away and to no longer let themselves be overwhelmed by the Russians. And we also have to acknowledge that in the field of ISR, and therefore the ability to anticipate an attack, well, Russia's loss of Starlink had a big impact. Let's say that if by chance an observation drone sees that a supply convoy is arriving for the Ukrainians, it can no longer instantly alert the team managing the FPV drones or the team that's going to fire mortars. And so there's a loss of time, and I have direct accounts from people who go to the front, in the Lyman or Kramatorsk area, for example. They arrive with their small vehicle, and usually they were used to seeing FPVs flying by, having to defend themselves, having to get out of their vehicle. Now, 10 minutes after they've passed, they see an FPV going to the area where they were 10 minutes ago. Simply because of the disappearance of Starlink and instant communication, that's also a global effect that reduces the effectiveness of drones for the Russians and the instant connection that everyone is used to on this front today. But the disappearance of Starlink has another effect. They were also piloting their drones over long distances. You remember at the end of last year, they had started hitting moving trains in Ukraine, and, well, the Ukrainians, on their side, have kept this ability to strike deep. And that's why you have a huge number of drones, especially what we call the FP2. The FP2 is operated via Starlink, and throughout all of occupied Ukraine, throughout Crimea, they are able to strike right up to the impact and control the drones, including against moving targets, whether on the ground or even helicopters, as we've seen several times now. And that really gives the Ukrainians a huge advantage with an extension of the kill zone against Russian logistics that stretches more than 50 kilometers behind the front line, which obviously makes things very difficult. But on the other hand, there is still one area where the Russians remain largely dominant: glide bombs, the bombs that are dropped by planes, where Russia still sends about 2,000 glide bombs per month with its fighter jets, for example, Sukhoi 34s. Whereas on the Ukrainian side, it's estimated to be only 600 to 800 bombings. They have less volume, but their bombings are more effective, especially with bombs like the AASM Hammer, which can follow complex trajectories and, for example, come in vertically onto a bunker and be able to penetrate deep inside, while Russian bombs, on the other hand, tend to glide along a straight trajectory, which can cause them to explode on a building that was in their path, if, for example, they were aiming in an urban environment. But since this trajectory is predictable, the Ukrainians are able to get into its path. And now there are cases of Russian glide bombs being intercepted with kamikaze drones or laser-guided rockets. So it's the same, the air defense is improving and becoming more effective. On the Ukrainian side, it should become more effective in fighting against glide bombs as well. And it should also be mentioned the Ukrainians have just announced the launch of their first locally produced smart-guided glide bomb. This no longer relies solely on the French AASM and the American JDAMs. Now they are also producing them themselves. If we move even further away from the front and look at the very long-range strikes, especially with long-range missiles, low cost. The Shaheds on one side and the FP-1S, the Ludus, on the Ukrainian side. Well, for the first time in March, Ukraine launched more long-range strike systems than Russia. Ukraine accelerated its efforts, while Russia struggles to find needed components due to sanctions, depending on your perspective. But also with Iran disappearing as a supplier to Russia, which was obviously being targeted by the United States, and it was no longer able to supply the few hundred Shahed drones it used to provide each month. In addition, Russia intercepts about 3/4 of the strike systems launched by the Ukrainians, which is obviously quite a good score. But the vast majority of these interceptions are done with conventional missiles, which are very expensive and that the Russians don't know how to produce. At the rate of Ukrainian strikes, while on the Ukrainian side, they intercept more than 90% of the Shahed drones launched against them. Thanks especially to small, low-cost interceptor drones, which I've mentioned before and which they began developing over 2 years ago, Russia has therefore tried to catch up in these small, low-cost interceptors so that it too can deal with the numerous vectors launched by Ukraine. When I say Russia, I mean all countries, Europe, the United States. Everyone is trying to catch up with Ukraine in this area to also be able to deal with the threat that we are discovering today in Iran, with the Shaheds that manage to hit their targets, that cause deaths, and that strike countries that are extremely wealthy, extremely well defended, with extremely expensive systems. Only the Ukrainians know how to do it, and that's why the Gulf countries are turning to Ukraine for help, which comes to these countries to bring its expertise with deals that seem quite advantageous since in exchange for Patriot missiles, that is to say Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, who were firing 2 to 3 Patriots to intercept each Shahed. There was a record of 6 Patriots fired at a single Shahed. So that's basically $10 million to intercept a system worth $50,000. Well, the Ukrainians, they destroy them and they get paid in Patriots. So Qatar, instead of spending 23 missiles, they only offer 1, and they have a guarantee of protection from these. So it's a win-win deal for everyone, and the Ukrainians, with these Patriot missiles, will be able to intercept Russian ballistic missiles, which are the hardest to destroy, obviously, and they can't intercept them with their traditional system, and they simply need the SAMP-T Mamba or the Patriots. And so that means they'll have a more favorable flow coming in than before. And so even the interception rate of ballistic missiles will now increase in the coming weeks and months in Ukraine. Another result of this war for Ukraine is that Gulf countries found some Shahed drones and missiles used against them had Russian components or were directly supplied by Russia. Yet these are the same countries that have helped Russia circumvent sanctions until now. It's a bit like the biter being bit. There is one certainty. The United Arab Emirates will stop helping Russia circumvent sanctions and get those spare parts that were being used against them. So that means there will be even fewer spare parts for Russia and even higher costs to try to find alternatives structurally. So it's bad for Russian supply, but there are strategic agreements being signed between Saudi Arabia and Ukraine. There are Ukrainian companies that have managed to raise funds. They raised $760 million from the United Arab Emirates alone for the Ukrainian company Firepoint, which makes these very long-range missiles. We can assume they'll keep increasing their pace and power, striking Russia even farther, especially for Firepoint with the famous Flamingo cruise missiles, which are now a success, with increasing costs. But in terms of effectiveness, 1 ton, 3,000 kilometers, these are really very interesting things, obviously. The Russians are reaching their limit or stagnating because they're losing allies and the agreements that kept them producing. But in this long-distance war, the advantage is now shifting to Ukraine, both in terms of quantity, as we just said, but also in the effectiveness of the strikes, since a greater proportion of the missiles that are fired are hitting their targets. Russian infrastructure is more fragile due to its reliance on large, well-known Soviet-era factories. But what about the Ukrainians? On their side, they've had no choice from the beginning but to set up their production in a decentralized way, in very small units that work together, so that the destruction of one unit doesn't prevent the others from working. This makes the system much more resilient. Whereas for Russia, once its large infrastructures are hit, it disrupts the entire production chain. It's the same thing for energy. Today, energy is what the Russians live on, what keeps them going. Thanks to energy exports, Ukraine has managed to destroy 40% of Russia's energy, oil, and gas export capacity. So obviously, well, it's not something they can repair easily. The facilities are visible, they're known. And the latest generation, especially the Lyuti, which is a long-range Kamikaze drone that's very effective. There's a kind of stealth the Russians still can't detect, as they explained to me. I'll soon share with you an interview I was able to do with the head of long-range strike operations involving loitering drones. That means they're not only stealthy and undetected by radar, but over the last few dozen kilometers, they can cut their engines, making no noise to warn you they're coming. So the Russians don't hear, don't see, don't detect. There are strikes falling on their refineries, which aren't protected. So that leads to very interesting results for the Ukrainians, explaining their recent significant successes. Knowing, I repeat, that there are 6 new models of Kamikaze drones or cruise missiles that will come into service in 2026, including the FP-7 and FP-9, which are also ballistic missiles. And a little news that just came out, so I can talk about it now. The Ukrainians have crossed the 100-kilometer altitude mark several times, which means they can officially access space autonomously. By developing technologies and recovering what dated back to the Soviet era, they are in the process of reacquiring ballistic missile capability. 100-kilometer altitude potentially means thousands and thousands of kilometers of range. I told you in a video that when we met some of the CEOs over there, it felt like listening to Elon Musk before he went crazy. There was a reason I used that analogy, Elon Musk. He wanted to launch things into space. Ukrainians want to do it cheaper than SpaceX and have already proven several times this year that they can. So the consequence of all this, obviously, is that on the Ukrainian front, well, it's been a very long time since I've seen soldiers who were this optimistic, at least in terms of their ability to hold on. I'm not saying the war is easy or there are no daily casualties, but losses are lower than before. The Russians, despite many assaults, aren't making progress. They're stalled. And we've been seeing this for several months now, with Russian advances becoming weaker and weaker. When the Russians try to mobilize vehicles, armored units, or launch assaults, it's being noticed earlier and earlier. In the south, the Ukrainians have managed to liberate several hundred square kilometers, but it's still just a small margin. That won't change the course of the war, but Russia has less money, its narrative is collapsing, and its soldiers are demoralized. You have your bloggers telling you, well, we're really in a dead end here. So, once again, I truly hope with all my heart that this will push the Russian authorities to reconsider their approach, to understand that they won't be able to invade Ukraine by force. And above all, with Magyar's election in Hungary, the €90 billion loan to Ukraine will be able to be released. I want to make that clear. It's a loan that will be repaid by the dividends from Russian assets or directly by Russian war reparations. So it doesn't cost us anything. It's a loan so that Ukraine can finance itself, can defend itself, can protect us. And so, logically, the Russians can no longer hope for an economic collapse of Ukraine, just as they might have wished this winter, with the pressure on electricity production, or as they hoped, with the end of the money Ukraine had until now. So the Russians know that this means several more years of funding in euros. I want to make it clear, in euros. He kept insisting on that. And to waste industrial, economic, and human potential in a war they can no longer win. That's it. Now all that's left is to wait. Any aid we provide Ukrainians will help them hold on, accelerate, and survive. I always put the links in this video's comments so you can help our friends. Thanks to your support, they've made it this far and are grateful. All right, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you very soon.